I put this video together because Bloodborne is one of those games that never really lets you go. The lore lives in item descriptions, in cryptic NPC dialogue, in architecture and enemy placement. And there is one corner of that lore that I kept coming back to, which is the events that the game implies could happen theoretically if certain conditions were met or if certain forces were left unchecked. I wanted to build a video around those possibilities, not definitive answers, interpretations, things the game points toward without spelling out. When I was assembling this, I made one deliberate choice. I kept the focus on scenarios that feel grounded in the game's internal logic. No wild fan fiction, just extrapolations from what the lore actually gives us. With that said, there is one thing I need from you. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Bloodborne is a game about a city that looked too long into something it was never supposed to see, and what happened because of it is one of the most terrifying slow burns in video game history. Chapter 1. The Great Ones and What Happens. If they finish what they started. Yharnam was not always a ruin. That is the first thing worth remembering. The city had a history, had people who built it and maintained it and believed in it. And somewhere in that history, someone found something they could not explain and decided to study it rather than walk away from it. The discovery of Pthumerian ruins beneath the city is the point where everything begins to tilt. The Pthumerians were an ancient civilization who came into contact with the Great Ones, the alien entities that orbit the periphery of Bloodborne's world, and that contact did not destroy them immediately. It changed them. It elevated them in certain respects. The Pthumerians became guardians of the eldritch truth, tending to the old labyrinth and to the old blood that flowed through its deepest chambers, and for a time this arrangement seemed to work. The key word there is seemed. What the lore suggests, and what becomes clearer the deeper you go into the Chalice dungeons, is that the Pthumerians were not elevated in any kind of equal or mutual relationship with the Great Ones. They were, in a more honest reading, selected, maintained. The way a researcher might maintain a laboratory, the Great Ones needed something from the physical world, something that their own nature prevented them from accessing directly, and the Pthumerians provided proximity. What that proximity cost the Pthumerians over generations is written into the dungeon architecture itself. You find warped enemies, corrupted creatures, spaces that should not geometrically be possible within the scale of the ruins you're navigating. The dungeons get stranger the deeper you go, because the influence of the Great Ones gets heavier the deeper you go. Now bring that process forward in time to Yharnam. The healing church discovered the Pthumerian ruins and found the old blood, and their interpretation of what they had found was filtered through a human lens. They saw medicine, they saw power, they saw the capacity to heal injuries and cure diseases that had previously been death sentences, and that reading was not entirely wrong. The old blood did do those things, but the old blood also carried something else with it, something that was either a side effect or a feature, depending on which Great One you think was involved, and that something else was the slow erosion of the boundary between waking consciousness and the dream. The healing church gave the blood to Yharnam, the city drank, and the Great Ones waited. The theoretical event this chapter is building toward is simple to state and genuinely disturbing to sit with. What happens if the Great Ones complete the process that the old blood was apparently designed to facilitate? The game's various endings gesture at different stages of this, but the lore scattered across item descriptions and NPC dialogue suggests a specific endpoint. The Great Ones, according to the game's internal logic, hunger for a child. Not a biological child in a simple sense, but something more like a successor, a consciousness that has been sufficiently transformed by contact with the old blood and the dream to function as a bridge. The dull, Gehrman, the moon presence, even Mergo, these are all nodes in a system that seems to be attempting to produce or locate or cultivate that bridge. The scary thing is not that the Great Ones are malevolent. The game is careful not to make them simply evil. What is scary is that they appear to be operating with a patience and a methodology that human timescales cannot meaningfully engage with. The Thumerian civilization ran its full course and still serves a purpose in the dungeon architecture. Yharnam is being consumed in a single night, and that night has clearly been engineered. The process has been running long enough that the moon presence has Gehrman trapped in a dream that may have lasted decades. If no hunter ever came to Yharnam, if the night never ended, the lore suggests the transformation would simply continue until there was nothing left to transform. A city replaced by something else, wearing its architecture. Think about what a city of beasts actually means in this context. The afflicted in Yharnam are not simply sick, they are changing. The beast scourge is not random mutation, it is a direction. Clawmark runes, beast blood pellets, the way certain enemies retain enough intelligence to use weapons or protect specific locations, all of this points toward a transformation that has structure to it. The beasts of Yharnam are not the end point, they are a stage. What comes after a city of beasts, if the process continues unchecked, is what the deeper chalice dungeons are already showing you. Spaces that no longer follow the rules of the world you entered from. The Thumerian Queen Yharnam, the one you find in the Eye-Hill Root Chalice, is one of the clearest indicators of where this process leads for the people caught inside it. She was a queen of a civilization, advanced enough to build an underground labyrinth spanning continents. She came into direct contact with a Great One. She carried a Great One's child. And when you find her, she is a pale, hollow figure, standing in a cavern, perpetually bleeding from wounds that represent the loss of something that was taken from her, waiting in a space that has been cut off from normal time. That is not an ending. That is what a person looks like after the Great Ones are finished with them, preserved, emptied, maintained as a marker. The people of Yharnam are heading toward a version of that, not necessarily that exact fate, but something in the same category. The old blood does not kill its hosts, not directly. It refines them towards something. The afflicted who become beasts are the ones whose minds could not keep pace with what the blood was doing to their bodies. The ones who drink enough and survive and retain their intelligence, like certain bosses, like certain hunters, show what happens when the transformation gets further along without fragmenting. They become something that is no longer simply human but has not yet arrived at whatever the Great Ones are cultivating. That gap, that in-between state, and is where Yharnam is frozen on the night the game takes place. What theoretically happens, if nothing stops it, is that Yharnam finishes the crossing. The architecture of the lecture building, the research hall, the altar of despair, these are all spaces that already exist partially on the other side of that crossing. The enemies in those spaces are people who went through the surgery that Mikolash and the School of Mensis were conducting, which was a deliberate attempt to accelerate the transformation. The result is enemies that float, that have had their heads replaced with, or augmented by, things that are not heads, in any normal sense, that respond to you in ways that suggest they are perceiving a different version of the space you're both standing in. They made it part way. They are stuck. And they are a preview, a fully transformed Yharnam, if the process ran to completion, would not look like a city anymore. It would not look like the Chalice dungeons either, because those are ancient and partially inert. It would look like what the fishing hamlet points toward. That village at the end of the world, cut off from normal time, populated by creatures that were once human fishermen, built around the corpse of a Great One that was dragged from the sea by people who thought they were taking something, rather than being taken. The hamlet is a complete transformation. Everyone there finished the crossing. The humanity is still visible if you look for it. The fishing nets, the architecture, the way the shark giants move like people doing tasks. But what they are now is something else. That is theoretically what Yharnam becomes. Not destroyed, finished. A place where the transformation completes and the city continues to exist in the same way the hamlet continues to exist, as a space that has been permanently relocated to somewhere adjacent to where it started, populated by things that remember being human the way you remember a dream after you have been awake for several hours. Technically present, functionally gone, now consider the scale of that. Yharnam was a major city. The old blood spread from it to other regions. The game mentions other countries receiving shipments of blood ministration. The transformation that is happening in Yharnam on the night of the hunt is not necessarily contained to Yharnam. The lore suggests it is happening fastest there because the concentration of old blood is highest there, but the implication is that the same process, at a slower pace, is already in motion elsewhere. The Great Ones do not appear to be in a hurry. They have demonstrated through the Thumerians that they're comfortable operating across timescales that swallow entire civilizations. A few extra decades while the blood spreads further would not represent any particular urgency for them. This is the scenario that the game's world is quietly describing if you read everything carefully. Not an apocalypse in the dramatic sense of fire and screaming. Something quieter and, in some ways, more disturbing. A world that is being slowly rotated to face a different direction, one city at a time, beginning with the city that looked into the abyss first and deepest. Yharnam is not a warning to the world. It is a demonstration, proof that the process works. The amygdalae that cling to the buildings in the later areas of the game are, according to the lore, invisible to people who lack sufficient insight. Most of the citizens of Yharnam cannot see them. They are simply there, attached to the city, waiting. The fact that they are invisible to the uninitiated is not just a narrative trick. It is a description of a relationship. The amygdalae are already present in Yharnam in large numbers. They have been there long enough that their presence is normalized for those who can see them and imperceptible to those who cannot. This is not a future invasion. This is an occupation that has already happened, so thoroughly that most of the occupied do not know they are occupied. The theoretical completion of what the Great One started does not look like an invasion, because it has never been an invasion. It looks like a slow revelation. Like a photograph developing, the city is already transformed in certain respects. The amygdalae are already there. The old blood is already in the population's veins. The dream is already running. What happens at completion is not that something new arrives. It is that what has always been there becomes fully visible, and what was always happening becomes fully apparent. And the world that thought it was Yharnam realizes it has been something else for a very long time. That is a genuinely terrifying kind of ending. Not because it is violent, though it can be, but because it is a process of recognition. You were always in this. You just could not see it yet. And now you can. And now there is no going back to not seeing it. The Thumerians could not go back. The Healing Church could not go back. Gehrman could not go back. The theoretical event at the centre of Bloodborne's lore is not a disaster that happens to a world. It is a world that has been changed and then shown, at last, what it has become. And the question the game leaves open, the one it refuses to answer definitively across any of its endings, is whether anything on the other side of that revelation is worth surviving to see. I think the game's deliberate refusal to answer that question is what makes it so effective. You can read the star ending as a kind of hope. You can read the Yharnam sunrise as a kind of grace. But neither of those readings cancels out everything the lore is describing when you read the item descriptions and piece together the chalice history and trace the old blood back to its source. The theoretical event is already in motion when the game begins. The only question is where on that process the player's particular run of the game lands. And the honest answer, the one the lore supports most consistently, is that it lands very close to the end of something. The night of the hunt is not a night like other nights. Something is being decided, The transformation is at a stage where it can either be redirected, consumed, or completed, and those three options map cleanly onto the game's three main endings. What the Great Ones want is the completion. What the Moon Presence engineered was a system to produce it. What Gehrman and the workshop and the hunters represent is a mechanism that produces the raw material. And somewhere in that system, the player character arrives. The scary theoretical event is not something that might happen someday in Yharnam. It is something that has been happening for generations and is right at the edge of culmination. The scale of that, the depth of history behind a single night of hunting, is what gives the game its particular atmosphere of inevitability. You are not preventing something. You are choosing how it ends. And some of those endings look, from a certain angle, like exactly what the Great Ones wanted all along. The dungeons below the city hold the oldest versions of this process. The Thumerians who tended the old blood for the Great Ones are still down there, in a sense. Their guardians and their rituals and their architecture are preserved in the Chalice dungeons in a state that suggests something between memory and reality. When you descend into those dungeons, you're not simply exploring ruins. You are moving through a version of history that has been kept intact by forces that do not experience time the way the surface world does. The deeper you go, the older the version of the process you're witnessing. At the very bottom, in the Great Pthumeru Hill Chalice, you are seeing what this looked like before Yharnam existed, before the Healing Church, before hunters, before any of the surface history that frames the game. What you find at the bottom is not a beginning in any comforting sense. It is evidence that the process was already fully developed before any of the human history you know about. The Great Ones were already doing this with the Pthumerians. Yharnam is not an origin, it is a repetition. The theoretical event at the top of this chapter is not new. It has happened before. The Thumerians went through it. The fishing hamlet went through it. Yharnam is the latest iteration. Whatever the Great Ones are building toward or harvesting, the mechanism has been refined across multiple civilizations over a time span that the game does not fully quantify but strongly implies is enormous. Consider what the Great One known as Ebrietas represents in this framework. She is called the Daughter of the Cosmos, and she resides in the Altar of Despair, a space within the Healing Church's own architecture that the Church built specifically to house her. She was left behind by the other Great Ones, abandoned or stationed or both. The Church found her and formed a relationship with her that was not simply academic. The choir conducted rituals involving her. The architecture around her in the altar shows evidence of prolonged contact, of the kind of spatial distortion you see in other great one-adjacent spaces. Whatever the Church was learning from Ebrietas or doing with Ebrietas was happening over an extended period of time, and Ebrietas was apparently compliant with it, or at minimum not hostile to it. This is strange when you compare it to how the Great Ones are generally characterized. They do not communicate with humans in direct ways. They transmit insight. They send messages through dreams and nightmares. They affect the people around them through proximity rather than deliberate instruction. Ebrietas seems to operate differently, or at least the Church's relationship with her suggests a more sustained engagement than the typical pattern of Great One contact. She can be found weeping over what appears to be a corpse. She attacks when you intrude on that morning. But she was also, apparently, the source of significant choir research into the Great Ones and into the blood. The theoretical extension here is what would happen if the Church's research with Ebrietas had continued uninterrupted. The endpoints the research was approaching, the stuff the choir was doing in the upper cathedral ward with the celestial creatures and the living failures and the orphanage, these are all downstream of the sustained contact with Ebrietas. If that contact had produced what the choir was trying to produce, the controlled ascension they were reaching for, the result would have been people who were both human enough to exist in the world and elevated enough to communicate with the Great Ones in a direct and functional way. Bridges, in the most literal sense. The failure of the choir's experiments is everywhere in the upper cathedral ward. The celestial emissary, who might be a version of a successful result if the threshold is low enough, is still a creature you fight as an enemy. The living failures are exactly what their name describes. The blood drunk by the orphans in the orphanage produced results that the game documents through the things you find there. And none of those results are what the choir was hoping for. The gap between human physiology and Great One existence appears to be too large to bridge in a controlled way, with the tools available to the Church, even with ebrietas as a direct source of contact and insight. But the attempts keep being made. Every generation of the Church pushes further. The early founders used the blood as medicine. The middle scholars used it as a research tool. The late choir used it as a direct transformation agent. The trajectory is consistent, and the end point it is approaching is the one where a person crosses over rather than simply being influenced from a distance. The theoretical completion of that trajectory is a human being who successfully makes the crossing. And the question that crossing raises is what happens to the world once someone has done it. The doll offers a partial window into this. She was made by Yharnam, from a real person, built to serve the dream. She exists in the dream fully, and the waking world not at all. She is human in her manner, and her care, and her speech, but she is not human in her nature. She occupies a space between categories that was created deliberately by the moon presence's influence on Yharnam's construction of her. She is not transformed from human to something else. She was made as something else from the beginning. But the category she occupies between human and not human, between the world and the dream, is adjacent to the category that the choir's research was trying to produce. What the choir wanted was not a doll. They wanted something with agency, with capability, with the ability to act in the world, while also having the access to Great One perception and Great One contact that the doll has by virtue of existing in the dream. A choir success would be a person who could walk through Yharnam and speak with the Great Ones and translate between those two registers of existence. The theoretical event this suggests is not a single person who achieves this. It is a generation of people who achieve it, produced by the Church's distribution of blood and its systematic research, and what that generation does with their position between worlds is the question that the lore leaves most dramatically open. The Great Ones in this game have always had human agents. The moon presence has Yharnam, the healing Church's Great One contacts have produced the choir and its researchers. The Thumerians had their queens and their high priests, their mediators between the ordinary human population and the Great One influence. What distinguishes the theoretical successful choir result from all of these existing agents is completeness. Yharnam is trapped. The high priests were converted. The agents the game presents are all partial and compromised in specific ways that limit their effectiveness as genuine bridges. A fully realized bridge, a person who completed the crossing and retained their human world agency, would be something the Bloodborne world has never had. Whether the Great Ones want this or have been specifically preventing it is an ambiguity the lore maintains carefully. The moon presence's behaviour around the secret ending, where it attacks any hunter who tries to ascend via the umbilical cords, suggests that at least one Great One does not want the crossing to happen on the human side's terms. But the moon presence's agenda is not clearly identical to all the Great One's agendas. Ebrietas weeps, Murgo cries. The Great One in the fishing hamlet was dragged from the sea and killed. These are not entities that appear to have a unified and coherent plan for what they want from humanity. They appear in some readings to be as confused by the situation as the humans are. A world in which the Great Ones themselves are not unified in their purposes, and in which the various mechanisms for Great One contact, the dream, the blood, the nightmares, the chalice rituals, are all producing different kinds of results. depending on which Great One is involved and which humans are involved, is a world in much more complicated trouble than a simple invasion or a simple corruption would suggest. The theoretical events in Bloodborne are not the product of a single organised supernatural force with a clear plan. They are the product of multiple enormous entities with obscure and possibly conflicting purposes, all pressing on a human world that does not have the tools to perceive them clearly, let alone to manage what they are doing. That complexity is what makes the lore so dense and so rewarding to dig into, and it is what makes the theoretical events so genuinely frightening. Because there is no single threat to identify and oppose, there is a field of influences, some of which may even counteract each other in unpredictable ways, all of which are producing changes in the world that compound and interact in ways that no individual or institution has the complete picture to understand or anticipate. The Great One that corresponds to the moon presence wants one thing. Ebrietas, left behind by her kind, may want something different, or may simply want what all abandoned things want, which is a kind of contact that her nature prevents her from having in any straightforward way. The entity in the fishing hamlet sea wanted or wants something that the fisherman's community was useful for, in a way the game leaves deliberately unclear. Murgo, an infant, may want nothing in the goal-directed sense at all, and the crying that fills the nightmare around Murgo may be less a weapon, and more simply what an infant Great One does when it exists, regardless of any human concern for the consequences. Multiple entities, multiple purposes, multiple ongoing processes in the one city of Yharnam, and its history, and its dungeons, and its satellite communities like the Hamlet and Canehurst. The theoretical completion of any one of these processes would be significant. The theoretical simultaneous completion or collision of several of them is what the game actually seems to be depicting on the night of the hunt. Everything is at a peak. Everything is at a point of decision or culmination. The night is not just bad luck. It is the moment when everything that has been building for generations arrives at the same point at the same time. That simultaneity is the most frightening theoretical event of all, if you take it seriously. Not any one transformation or any one Great One's agenda reaching its end point. All of them reaching their endpoints in the same night, in the same city, with interactions between them that no one predicted and that the architecture of the world around them was not built to contain. Yharnam on the night of the hunt is not just a city with a plague problem. It is the intersection of multiple enormous processes, all of which are at their most consequential stage, and the city does not have enough room to hold all of that at once. The hunters move through it and fight in it, and die and wake in it, and from inside the hunt it looks like a single, terrible night of violence and madness. From the outside, from the perspective of the lore read in its full context, it looks like the convergence point of a history that was always going to arrive here. And the question is not whether the convergence produces something catastrophic. It obviously does. The question is what the catastrophe is the beginning of, because in Bloodborne, the catastrophes are never simply endings. They're always transitions. The city becoming something else, the process advancing to its next stage, the night producing its morning, whatever kind of morning that is. Chapter 2. The Scourge Spreads Beyond Yharnam. The old blood did not stay in Yharnam. This is the thing the game mentions almost in passing, but which has enormous implications if you follow the thread. Blood ministration was exported. Other cities, other regions, other populations received shipments of Yharnam's medical miracle, and those populations drank. They were sick people who wanted to live, or wealthy people who wanted the edge the blood offered, or simply people who trusted the reputation of the healing church and the medical establishment that had built itself around the old blood. They drank and they changed in the way that the blood changes everyone, slowly and at first invisibly, and then faster and more visibly as the transformation progresses. The theoretical event here is the scourge spreading to the wider world. The game contains it to Yharnam because that is where the story takes place, but the lore does not actually contain it. The exports happened. The blood travelled. The people elsewhere who received it are changing too, just more slowly, just without the additional concentration factor of living above the Pthumerian ruins and being surrounded by the highest density of old blood on the surface. What Yharnam is experiencing in a single night of apocalyptic transformation is what those other populations are experiencing across years or decades, which means it is harder to see, harder to recognize as the same phenomenon, easier to dismiss as ordinary illness or ordinary human behavior becoming slightly more erratic. Think about what it looks like from the outside when a community begins to show early beast scourge symptoms and no one knows what to look for. The aggression increases before anything physical changes. The early stages of the scourge are behavioral. People become irritable, then hostile, then violent, in ways that look like stress or mental illness or social breakdown rather than a medical transformation. The city or town experiencing it would not see hunters arriving to manage the problem. They would see crime statistics changing, would see reports of violence increasing, would see institutions struggling to manage populations that were becoming harder to manage. And no one would necessarily connect any of it to the blood ministration they received 2 years ago or 5 years ago from the church. The healing church understood this dynamic well enough to manage it in Yharnam itself, or to try to. The hunt existed precisely because the transformation was visible enough in Yharnam that something had to be done to contain the public knowledge of it. In other places, without a hunt, without hunters, without the church's internal understanding of what was actually happening, the early transformation would simply proceed unmanaged. The violence would escalate. The physical changes would eventually become undeniable. And by the time anyone in those communities understood that their population was transforming into beasts, it would be at a stage that was already very difficult to address without the tools and knowledge that Yharnam had developed. Consider a large city that had been receiving blood ministration for a decade. The blood's effects are not uniform in their timing. Different people transform at different rates depending on how much they consumed, their individual physiology, their exposure to other aspects of the scourge. A city of 100,000 people would not transform all at once. It would transform in waves, with the heaviest consumers going first, and those individuals becoming vectors for the accelerated spread because the scourge is contagious through physical contact in its advanced stages. The city would be in a state of escalating crisis that looked, from a distance, like a public health emergency of unknown origin. By the time the connection to the blood was made, or if it was ever made, the early transformers would already be attacking the people around them, and those people would be accelerating their own transformations through contact. The healing church's response to this, if it followed the Yharnam model, would be to send hunters, to establish a quarantine, to burn the evidence and manage the story. But the church in Yharnam is clearly struggling to manage just the one city, and the implication of the exported blood is that there are multiple cities in this condition, at various stages of the transformation, with the church either managing them in secret or having already lost the ability to manage them. The grand cathedral at the top of Yharnam and the resources the church commands are built on the income from the blood trade. That trade required customers. Those customers are out there somewhere in the world, and they drank. The specific terror of this theoretical event is that it describes a plague that has already been distributed before anyone understood it was a plague. The old blood does not look like a disease in its early stages. It looks like medicine because it functions as medicine in its early stages. The same substance that heals is the substance that transforms. There is no clean line between the therapeutic effect and the transformative effect because they are the same effect at different stages. You cannot take the healing without also taking the transformation. The people who received blood ministration in other parts of the world were not tricked in a simple sense. They received something that genuinely helped them, and that help came with a cost that was either hidden from them or not fully understood by the people selling it. The church's own internal records, the ones you find fragments of throughout the game, suggest that the understanding of what the Old Blood was doing was incomplete even within the institution for a significant part of its history. The early founders knew they had found something powerful and unknown. The middle generation of scholars knew more but disagreed about the implications. The late church, the one operating on the night of the game, knew the most and was the most committed to managing it as a secret. But the exports happened across the entire history of that institution, including the early period when the understanding was most incomplete. Blood was sent out before anyone knew what was going to happen to the people who drank it. This means the spread is not a future threat. It is a current reality that is simply not visible to the player, because the game takes place in Yharnam. The scourge is in other places right now, in the game's present tense. At whatever stage, a decade or more of slow transformation has reached in populations that received lower concentrations of the Old Blood. In some places, it may only be behavioural. In others, it may be at a stage that Yharnam was at several years before the game begins, manageable with sufficient resources and ruthlessness. In others, the ones where the blood reached populations that were already medically compromised, or where the concentration was higher, it may be at a stage that the hunting apparatus has already failed to contain. The world outside Yharnam is not shown in the game. That is a deliberate choice by From Software that serves the game's focused narrative. But the lore does not pretend that world does not exist. The game is set in a specific place, at a specific moment, in a crisis that has wider dimensions. And those wider dimensions are implied by enough specific lore details that you can sketch them in. The theoretical event of the scourge spreading beyond Yharnam is not speculative in the sense of requiring a leap. It follows directly from what the game establishes. The question is only how far it has spread and at what stage different populations currently are. The Healing Church's architecture in Yharnam tells you something about how the institution thought about its role. The Grand Cathedral is not just a hospital or a research facility. It is built for authority. The church positioned itself as the mediator between the Old Blood and the population, and that positioning was not just about Yharnam. An institution with that architecture, that ambition, those resources, built a distribution network. The blood trade was not local. The income that built the cathedral came from everywhere the church's reputation reached. And the church's reputation reached far because the Old Blood genuinely worked as medicine and word of genuine medical miracles travels. So the distribution network exists, and the blood that travelled through it carries the same properties as the blood in Yharnam. And the people at the far end of that network are in the process of finding out, slowly, and without the context to understand what they're finding out, that the miracle medicine came with a second purpose. The theoretical event of a world-spanning scourge is already in motion. Yharnam is the most advanced case, the control group, the proof of concept for what this looks like when it runs its full course. The rest of the world is following on a delay. What makes this theoretically possible, rather than simply certain, is the question of whether anyone outside Yharnam finds out what is happening and intervenes effectively. The game gives you no evidence that such intervention is occurring. There is no outside army at the gates of Yharnam trying to quarantine it. There are no emissaries from other nations demanding answers from the Healing Church. There is only the city and the night and the hunters. This absence of external response either means the outside world does not yet understand what Yharnam represents, or means it has been effectively suppressed by the Church, or means the outside world is already too compromised by its own versions of the scourge to mount a coherent response. None of those options are reassuring. The Cainhurst angle adds another layer to this. Cainhurst had its own relationship with the Old Blood, a different strain running through its aristocracy, producing different effects. the pale and bloodthirsty quality of the vile bloods rather than the beast scourge. The church declared Canehurst heresy and sent the executioners to deal with it, which tells you that there are at least multiple varieties of what the old blood produces when it interacts with different populations or different conditions. The scourge spreading through Yharnam's exports is the beast variety, but the Canehurst strain suggests that other populations might experience different versions of the same transformation, recognizable as related but distinct in their specific manifestation. Multiple varieties of a world-ending plague, each one the product of the same original source material interacting with different circumstances. The bodies in Canehurst are preserved in snow and stillness. Whatever happened there happened decisively, and the executioners finished their work. But the Canehurst strain did not originate in Canehurst. It came from outside, from the old blood, in a modified or contaminated form, and if it could reach Canehurst, it could reach other, isolated communities. The theoretical event of the scourge spreading is therefore not just the beast scourge of Yharnam radiating outward. It is potentially multiple strains of old blood transformation manifesting in different populations in different ways, each one producing a version of the crisis that has its own character and its own timeline and its own specific horror. A world dealing with that at the scale implied by the church's distribution network would be a world in deep trouble in ways that would be very hard to recognize as connected at first. Communities in crisis, populations changing, institutions failing to manage what they do not understand, and somewhere behind all of it, the quiet persistence of the Great One's influence, operating through the blood, patient and methodical, and not particularly concerned with how long any of this takes. The Grand Cathedral at the top of Yharnam was built with the income from this enterprise. That income was sustained for long enough to build something on that scale, which means the distribution network was running for a long time, which means the spread is deep. The theoretical event is not a fire that might start. It is a fire that has been burning for years, underground, in places where the smoke is not yet visible from the surface. Now think about the specific mechanics of contagion that the scourge relies on beyond the blood ministration itself. The beast scourge is not only transmitted through the old blood. Physical contact with advanced stage beasts accelerates the transformation in those who already carry the blood's influence. The bite, the scratch, the blood spatter from a beast attack, all of these can push someone who was progressing slowly to a much faster stage of the transformation. In Yharnam, the hunt exists partly to kill beasts, before this amplification mechanism can compound the problem further. The hunters are not only protecting the uninfected population from harm, they are specifically trying to prevent the accelerated transmission that comes from beast contact spreading to people who are on a slow trajectory and suddenly find themselves on a much faster one. In a city without hunters, that amplification mechanism runs unchecked. The early-stage behavioural cases, the ones who are aggressive and violent, but not yet physically transformed, begin attacking people around them. Those attacks produce new early-stage cases in previously unaffected individuals and accelerate existing cases to more advanced stages. The wave moves through the population faster and faster as the density of transmission vectors increases. A city of 50,000 might have a decade of slow behavioural drift, followed by a period of weeks or months, where the physical transformation becomes visible across a significant portion of the population simultaneously. That transition period, from slow drift to rapid visible change, is the most dangerous moment because it is the moment when the population is large enough in its transformed numbers to overwhelm any local authority, but before the transformation is advanced enough to significantly reduce the physical capacity of the afflicted. The window for intervention is small and depends on having both the knowledge to recognise what is happening and the resources to act on it. The Healing Church in Yharnam had both, had developed them specifically through the history of managing the scourge at home, and was still barely holding the line. A city that received the blood from Yharnam's distribution network would have neither the knowledge nor the prepared resources. It would reach the dangerous transition period without any meaningful capacity to manage it, and at that point the escalation would be very difficult to stop with ordinary means. The theoretical event in its worst form is not a single city going through this. It is a network of cities at staggered stages of the process, some of them having already passed the dangerous transition period and having reached a state of advanced transformation, while others are still in the slow drift, all connected to each other through the ordinary channels of commerce and travel that cities use to maintain their relationships. And the people in those ordinary channels, the merchants and travellers and workers who move between cities, are carrying the scourge with them without knowing it, accelerating the process in new places as they arrive, connecting the staggered timelines into a single advancing wave. The Healing Church's quarantine of Yharnam, which the hunt represents in part, is an attempt to contain this network effect, keep the most advanced case isolated, prevent the export of blood from reaching its final stages before the Church can find a solution, or at least maintain the illusion that a solution is being sought. The hunt's purpose is not only to manage the beasts within Yharnam, it is to prevent the worst-case version of Yharnam from being visible to the outside world, long enough to trigger the panic response that would force confrontation with what the Church's blood trade has actually done. Alfred and the executioners carry a specific relevance here. The executioners were formed specifically to oppose the vile blood heresy at Canehurst, which was the Church's response to a different strain of old blood corruption. The existence of a dedicated order of executioners implies that the Church considered Canehurst dangerous enough as a contamination vector to warrant elimination rather than management. The vile bloods, unlike the beast scourge, do not obviously transform the way the beast scourge does. They remain more human in appearance, while their blood becomes a different kind of threat. This matters for the spread scenario because a transformation that does not produce visible, beast-like changes would be much harder to identify and quarantine in distant populations. The vile blood strain in the wider world would be nearly invisible until it was very advanced. The aristocratic context of Canehurst is important too. The old blood that produced the vile blood transformation reached people of high social status and significant resources. If a similar strain reached high-status individuals in other communities through the blood trade's upper-tier distribution, the resulting transformation would be happening in populations with the resources to hide it effectively, to manage their own exposure, to maintain the appearance of normalcy while the blood did its work internally. The Church's quarantine response assumes that transformation is visible and that visible transformation is what you quarantine. A hidden transformation in a resourceful population would operate entirely outside the quarantine model. This is the complete shape of the theoretical scourge spread event when you account for all the variables the law introduces. Not simply one transformation type radiating outward from one city, multiple transformation types, some visible and some not, spreading through different social strata via different channels, at different rates, with different windows for intervention, all originating from the same source and all converging toward the same general endpoint of Great One influence saturating the human population at a scale that makes the Yharnam crisis look contained by comparison. The Healing Church sat at the centre of all of this and understood at least parts of it. The secrecy they maintained around the blood's true nature was not simply about protecting their reputation or their income, though it served both purposes. It was an attempt to prevent the full scope of what they had done from being understood by anyone, including themselves. The Church's upper echelons were deeply invested in the transformation being a feature rather than a catastrophe. They had built their theology and their research program around the idea that the Great Ones were to be approached and embraced rather than feared and resisted. In that framework, the spread of the scourge was not a disaster, it was progress. That theological reframing is perhaps the most frightening aspect of the spread scenario. The people most capable of intervening in the crisis are the people most ideologically committed to not seeing it as a crisis. The Church's capacity to respond to the spread of the scourge beyond Yharnam was constrained not only by practical limitations of resources and knowledge, but by a genuine belief that the transformation was pointing towards something good. Even within the Church's own terms, there was disagreement about this. The early founders who wanted medical application versus the later scholars who wanted transcendence. But the institutional momentum by the time of the game's events was firmly on the transcendence side, and the transcendence framework did not have a quarantine response, which is another way of saying that the theoretical spread of the scourge beyond Yharnam had no institutional break. The institution with the most knowledge about what was happening was the institution most committed to letting it happen. The outside world was either ignorant or compromised. The hunters were managing symptoms rather than causes. And the blood continued its work in every community that had drunk from it, carrying the Great One's influence to the farthest reaches of the distribution network, patient and methodical and very, very thorough. Chapter 3: The Moon Presence and the Dream. Without end. There is a version of Bloodborne's story that never ends, not because the game loops, though it does loop, but because the logic of the dream, the mechanism that the moon presence uses to maintain the hunt, does not have a natural terminus. It runs until something stops it, and the things that are capable of stopping it are rare and specific, and require a particular combination of circumstances that the system itself appears to be designed to prevent from occurring. The theoretical event in this chapter is a dream that continues indefinitely because nothing ever stops it, and what that means for everyone caught inside it. Gehrman is the anchor. The game tells you this through the final boss encounter, and through the item descriptions around him, and through the doll's dialogue. He was the first hunter, the one who made whatever arrangement the moon presence required in the deep past, and he has been in the dream since that arrangement was made. He wants out. The whole emotional arc of the Gehrman encounter is the desperation of someone who's been trapped for what appears to be decades, at minimum, possibly longer, in a space that is not the world, but is a perfect replica of a portion of it, tending a system that he helped build and cannot escape. The moon presence needs him there. He is the warden of the mechanism. Without him, the dream does not function. But what happens if Gehrman had never found a hunter capable of ending the cycle? What if no player character ever arrived with enough insight to see the dream for what it was, and enough power to either kill Gehrman and take his place, or kill the moon presence itself? The answer the lore implies is that the dream continues. Gehrman continues. The hunters continue dying and waking, and dying in the dream's version of the hunt, accumulating experience that feeds the cycle, and the moon presence continues receiving whatever it receives from this arrangement. The hunters in the dream are worth thinking about carefully here. You meet a few of them. They are at various stages of awareness about their situation. Some have been in the dream long enough to have lost significant coherence. The specifics of how memory and identity survive in the dream are not fully spelled out, but the implication of talking to the NPCs in the hunter's dream and comparing their states is that the dream is not a kind place to be stuck in for a long time. It preserves you in some functional sense, keeps you capable of hunting, but it does not preserve your sense of self in any stable way. Extended time in the dream produces hunters who are progressively less connected to whatever they were before they entered it. Gehrman shows you the far end of that process. He is functional. He is articulate. He tends the dream's garden. But there is something deeply wrong with him in a way that goes beyond sadness or trauma. He has been maintained in a state that is not living and not dying and not dreaming in any normal sense, for an indeterminate but clearly enormous span of time, by an entity that needs him there. The Gehrman you encounter is the product of that maintenance. Whatever he was when he first built the workshop and trained hunters and made his arrangement with the moon presence, he is not that anymore. The dream has done something to him over the years that cannot be undone by kindness or conversation or the doll's care for him. Now imagine that process running indefinitely. Not just for Gehrman, but for every hunter the dream accumulates. Each new hunter who enters the dream and fails to either end the cycle or ascend adds another consciousness to the system, and that consciousness undergoes the same slow erosion that Gehrman has undergone, just at a faster rate because they arrived more recently and with less context. The dream fills up with fragments, people who remember being hunters but cannot hold the memory of what came before, people who fight and die and wake because the alternative, stopping, is not available to them in any meaningful way. The nightmare of Mensis is a parallel to the dream that shows you what this looks like when it goes wrong in a specific way. The scholars of the school of Mensis entered a nightmare, or created one, deliberately, trying to contact a great one. They succeeded, in the worst way. They made contact with Murgo, the infant great one, and the contact shattered most of them immediately. The ones who survived the initial contact are the spider-limbed creatures you find wandering the nightmare's corridors, still wearing their Mensis cages, still alive in some technical sense, but clearly not intact as people. They have been in the nightmare since the ritual, and the nightmare has done what extended contact with Great One influence does to human minds. The dream is a more refined version of this. The moon presence built it better, or maintains it more carefully, because it needs functional hunters rather than shattered ones. But the direction of the effect is the same. Given enough time, the hunters in the dream become like the Mensis scholars. Not immediately, not catastrophically, but incrementally. The dream as an indefinitely running system is a machine that consumes human consciousness in a very slow and methodical way, producing from that consumption something that feeds the moon presence's purposes, and replacing consumed hunters with new ones as the cycle brings fresh arrivals. The theoretical event here is not a single night of horror. It is an eternal night, the dream without a natural ending, perpetuating across timescales that dwarf the already enormous timescales of the Thumerian civilization, grinding through hunters the way a mill grinds wheat, producing from each one something that is fed back into the Great One's purposes, and continuing because nothing in the system's internal logic has a stopping condition. What would the world look like from the outside of a dream that had been running for centuries? Yharnam would be in permanent stasis, always in the night of the hunt, always producing hunters who enter the dream and either die permanently or wake and die again in an unbroken cycle. The city itself under the night of the hunt and the influence of the moon presence appears to exist in a kind of temporal bubble. The amygdalae are present, the beasts roam, the hunters patrol. It does not seem to be aging or progressing toward any kind of external resolution, because the dream is keeping it at a specific moment, the moment that produces the most useful hunting, the moment that best serves whatever the moon presence needs from the arrangement. A permanent dream is a permanent Yharnam, frozen at the worst moment of its history. The citizens who are not yet beasts, the few who barricade themselves in their homes and wait out the night, wait forever. They either transform eventually in the safety of their own locked rooms, or they survive until starvation or simple despair takes them, and the city gradually empties of everyone who was not useful to the dream's purposes, leaving only the beasts and the hunters and Gehrman in his garden and the moon presence somewhere above it all. The doll is one of the more genuinely melancholy elements of this theoretical scenario. She exists in the dream to serve the hunters, and she does so with what seems like genuine care, or at least a very good simulation of it. But she is also, in some sense, a prisoner of the dream in the same way Gehrman is. She cannot leave. She was made for this place, and she will be here when every hunter who has ever entered the dream has burned out and been replaced. In a dream without end, she tends to an endless succession of people who are slowly losing themselves to the same process that already consumed Gehrman, and she watches it happen again and again with the same gentle attentiveness. And that attentiveness might be genuine care, or it might be something more complicated that the law does not fully resolve. The moon presence needs the dream to function, but the law also suggests that the moon presence is not simply content. It makes Gehrman a prisoner. It hunts down anyone who tries to escape the cycle through the third umbilical cord route. It is maintaining something that it needs, but that also seems to cost it something, or that at least requires active intervention to sustain. An indefinitely running dream is not simply a peaceful eternity for the moon presence. It is work. The moon presence is working to maintain Gehrman's imprisonment, working to manage the hunters, working to keep the cycle producing whatever it produces. And work implies a motivation, which implies that the dream is producing something the moon presence considers worth the effort. What that something is, the law points toward but never specifies. The Great One's characteristic loss, their search for a child or a successor, the way the dream seems to be cultivating hunters toward some kind of transcendence, all of this suggests that the dream is not an end in itself. It is a preparation. The moon presence is preparing something through the hunters and through the dream and through the gradual transformation of Yharnam, and that something requires the dream to keep running until the preparation is complete. The indefinitely running dream is therefore not just a horror of consciousness being slowly consumed. It is a horror of purpose. The dream runs because the moon presence needs something specific from it, and the dream keeps running until that thing is produced. If it never produces it, the dream runs forever. If it eventually produces it, what happens next is the larger question of what the Great Ones do once they have what they need. Neither option is comfortable to contemplate at length. The mechanics of how hunters arrive in the dream are worth examining because they reveal something about how the indefinitely running dream accumulates its population. You arrive in the dream because you drank the blood of a dying hunter in the game's opening, which established a connection to Yharnam and through Yharnam to the dream. The blood is the medium. The dream is accessible to anyone who carries enough of the old blood and has enough insight, which in practice means hunters, because hunters are the people who carry the most blood and develop the most insight in the normal course of their work. So the dream's population grows in direct proportion to the success of the hunt as a social institution. More hunters means more dream arrivals, means more people accumulating in the dream's timeless space, each one slowly losing themselves to the dream's particular effect on human consciousness. The hunt's expansion, the healing church building the workshop, and training hunters and establishing the apparatus of the nightly patrol, was also the moon presence's expansion of its reserve of human consciousness, available for whatever the dream consumes it for. The purpose of the workshop, read in this light, is not purely what Gehrman believed it to be when he built it. He built it to train people to protect Yharnam. The moon presence used it to populate the dream. Every hunter who died in the hunt and woke in the dream and eventually became the kind of empty, fragmented thing that long dream exposure produces was another unit of the resource the moon presence was accumulating. The workshop was a trap that felt like a gift, which is a pattern you see everywhere in Bloodborne. The things that look most like help are the things most thoroughly designed for a purpose other than the help they appear to provide. If the dream runs indefinitely, the workshop continues to produce hunters, the hunters continue to populate the dream, and the moon presence continues to have an ever-growing reserve of slowly consumed human consciousness to draw on for whatever purposes require it. The dream's eternal night becomes a production system for something that the moon presence needs in quantities that require centuries of accumulation. What you need centuries of human consciousness for is the question the law raises and does not answer. But the scale of the accumulation and the deliberateness of the architecture around it suggests that whatever the moon presence is building toward is also large in scale. The specific horror of this for the individual hunters in the dream is that their experience of the dream is not static. It is not a simple imprisonment where you're frozen in place and time passes around you. You hunt, you wake, you die again. You wake again. The dream is active. You are doing things in it. But the things you're doing, the endless loop of the hunt that the dream supports, are slowly eroding the part of you that would remember why you were hunting in the first place. The purpose drains out. The memories of who you were before the hunt soften and then fade. What remains is the skill, the capacity for violence, the ability to navigate the city and kill its monsters, emptied of the context that made any of it mean something. Yharnam, at the end of this process, is what you get. Skilled, functional, emptied, desperate to stop but unable to stop because the moon presence will not permit it. The eternal dream produces an endless supply of Yharnams, each one the product of a different person who arrived with different reasons for hunting and different lives behind them, all of them converging over time toward the same hollowed-out state, all of them tending the same garden and building the same coffins and waiting for a hunter who will never come to end the cycle. Chapter 4. The Fishing Hamlet and What Sleeps in the Deep. The Fishing Hamlet is the end of a road that started before Yharnam and before the Healing Church and before the Old Blood that the Church built its institution around. You find it at the very end of the Old Hunters DLC, past everything that the main game's horror has prepared you to see, and it is genuinely different from anything that came before it. The architecture is recognisable. It was once a working fishing village, but what it is now, what its inhabitants have become, and what is buried beneath it, and in the sea around it, points toward a theoretical event that predates the central story of the game, by enough generations to make the central story look recent. The great one that the fishermen of the hamlet dragged from the sea was not the first discovery of this type, but it may be the most consequential one for the history of the game's world. The fishermen pulled the corpse from the water. They harvested it. They used its remains the way that fishing communities use the remains of anything they pull from the sea. And in doing so, they absorbed something from it that was not simply nutritional or material. The corpse was dead in the ordinary sense, but what the great ones carry with them is not dependent on their bodies being alive in the ordinary sense. And what the fishermen absorbed began changing them from that point. What they became is what you fight in the hamlet. The fishermen there have completed a version of the transformation that Yharnam is partway through, but the specific character of their transformation reflects the specific great one they came into contact with. They have eyes where eyes should not be. They have a connection to the sea and to the deep water that feels less like a mutation and more like a migration, as though their consciousness has partially relocated to wherever the drowned great one resided before it was pulled to the surface. They are hostile in the way that transformed people are hostile in Bloodborne. Not evil in any deliberate sense, but fundamentally unreachable, operating from a different set of priorities than the ones they started with. The theoretical event this chapter builds toward begins with a question. The Great One in the hamlet was dead, or at least still when the fishermen found it. But the lore scattered through the hamlet's item descriptions, and through the Simon, the harrowed questline suggests that the relationship between the hamlet and the deep water is ongoing. The transformation of the fishermen did not end with the original contact. It continues. They are still connected to whatever is in the sea. And the sea in Bloodborne is not a simple geographical feature. It is a boundary, the same way that certain architectural elements in the game function as boundaries between the ordinary world and the spaces adjacent to it where the great ones exist or partially exist. The deep water of the fishing hamlet is, in this reading, a membrane. The drowned great one was not simply dead. It was resting or waiting, or was in a state that does not map onto life and death in the way those terms apply to humans. The fisherman's contact with its remains created a connection through that membrane, and the transformation of the fisherman is what that connection looks like. From the human side of it, from the other side of the membrane, from whatever is in the deep water, the connection is something else. A set of tendrils running into the world, anchors, points of presence. The theoretical event is what happens if those tendrils are not cut. If the hamlet is left alone, if no one ever comes to interrupt what has been happening there since the fisherman pulled the great one from the sea, what does the connection eventually produce? The fishermen are already transformed. Their transformation has been running long enough for them to have fully lost their human social structures and replaced them with whatever the deep water's influence has substituted. The village still looks like a village. The architecture is intact, but the people in it are not operating the village as a village. They are operating it as something else, something that serves a purpose defined by the connection to the deep water rather than by the practical needs of a fishing community. The hamlet at full completion of this process, extrapolating from where it already is, would be a physical access point. Not a gateway in a dramatic architectural sense, not a portal with glowing edges, something more organic. The boundary between the surface and the deep would become locally thinner at the hamlet because the connection, established by the fisherman's original contact, would have been reinforced by every subsequent generation of transformed inhabitants, each one adding their own connection to the accumulating presence. The deep water would not simply be adjacent to the hamlet, it would partially be the hamlet. The same way that the deeper chalice dungeons are not simply underground, but partially somewhere else, partially in a space defined by proximity to Great One influence, rather than simply by geography. What comes up from the deep in this scenario is the question the lore raises most urgently. The Great Ones that exist below the ordinary world in Bloodborne are not always characterized by the same qualities as the ones you encounter in the game's main narrative. The Moon Presence and the Wet Nurse and Rom are all entities that seem at least partially oriented toward human affairs, toward the hunt and the transformation and the dream and the other apparatuses that produce whatever the Great Ones want from humanity. What lives in the genuine depths, in the deep water beneath the fishing hamlet, may be something different, older, less adapted to the membrane between its world and the human world, less concerned with the slow cultivation that characterizes the more present Great Ones. The lore suggests this through the way the hamlet's transformation is different from Yharnam's. Yharnam is being transformed towards something. The process has a direction, a cultivation character, a sense of specific purpose. The hamlet is not being cultivated, it is being consumed. The fishermen are not becoming more refined or more capable in the way that certain advanced beast scourge victims retain their intelligence. They are becoming more of the deep, less themselves and more of whatever the deep is. The transformation is not an elevation in any meaningful sense. It is a replacement. A fully opened connection between the fishing hamlet and the deep water would not produce hunters or scholars, or any kind of entity that retained human characteristics useful to Great One purposes. It would produce an expansion of the deep itself into the surface world, an area of the world that simply became more of the deep than it was previously, with the fishermen's transformed bodies as the medium through which that expansion occurred. The surface world gets smaller by exactly as much as the deep gets larger, and the deep has no particular interest in the surface world's continued existence or coherence. This is the theoretical event that the hamlet points toward. Not a controlled transformation, like Yharnam's, an uncontrolled one. A breach in the membrane that the Great Ones most invested in the hunt, and the dream did not engineer and may not want, because a breach of this kind does not produce useful hunters or useful transformations. It just produces more deep. More of whatever the original Great One in the sea represents, leaking into the surface world through the access point that the fisherman's contact created. Simon the Harrowed was at the hamlet. He was a hunter, one of the few who made it that far into the history of what the church and the hamlet and the old blood represent. His weapons and his attitude suggest a hunter who had been at this long enough to understand more than most. And what he found at the hamlet disturbed him in a way that the game's other content apparently did not, which is notable because the game's other content includes a lot of things designed to disturb. What Simon encountered at the hamlet was a transformation that had already gone too far. The fishermen were not recoverable in the way that early-stage beast scourge victims might theoretically be recoverable. The process had progressed beyond any stage where the tools available to hunters could meaningfully address the underlying cause rather than just the immediate threat. You can fight the fishermen, you can move through the hamlet, but the connection to the deep that made them what they are is not something a hunter can sever with any weapon in the game. The shark giants are the most extreme physical evidence of where the hamlet's transformation leads. They are enormous. They retain enough of their prior intelligence to use tools and to coordinate their behaviour in ways that suggest social organisation. But the social organisation they are performing is not human in any recognisable way. They are large, they are powerful, they have eyes in their mouths. They are what happens when the deep water's influence runs in a body for long enough without any of the moderating factors that the healing church's careful blood management attempted to maintain in Yharnam's population. The hamlet had no church, no hunters managing the pace of transformation, no theological framework trying to direct the change towards something useful. Just the contact and the deep water and the long, patient work of whatever is in the sea. The theoretical breach this suggests, if extended to its logical conclusion, is not a dramatic rupture between worlds. It is a gradual thickening of the deep's presence at the breach point. The hamlet's geography changes slowly. The buildings shift. The geometry of the space begins to follow deep water logic rather than surface world logic. The transformed inhabitants become less constrained by the physics of the surface world because the surface world's rules apply less completely to a space that is more deep than surface. And the deep extends itself, slowly and thoroughly, using the hamlet as its growing edge. The people who originally pulled the Great One from the sea did not understand what they were doing. They were fishing. They were doing their work. The fact that their work happened to intersect with an entity of enormous power that was in a state they could not recognize as alive was not their failure. It was simply their misfortune. The theoretical event that follows from their action is not a punishment for hubris in the way that some law readings frame it. It is a consequence of contact. The deep does not hold grudges. It does not punish. It simply continues being what it is, and what it is expands to fill whatever space becomes available to it through the contacts that happen to occur. The hamlet is one such contact. The Thumerians were another. The healing church was another. Every civilization in Bloodborne's history that touched the Great Ones created a contact point. And every contact point is a place where the deep gets a little closer to the surface, where the boundary between what the world is and what it is adjacent to becomes a little thinner. The hamlet is the most advanced contact point visible in the game, but the lore strongly implies it is not the only one, and the theoretical event of multiple advancing contact points is what gives the game its specific kind of cosmic dread. Chapter 5. Murgo and the Nightmare that Consumed Mensis. The School of Mensis did not make a simple mistake. The scholars there were some of the most educated people in the world of Bloodborne, working with the best available understanding of the old blood and the Great Ones that existed at the time they conducted their ritual. They knew they were attempting something dangerous. They knew that contact with a Great One without sufficient preparation could destroy the mind entirely. They built the Mensis cage specifically because of this knowledge. The cage was not magical protection. It was a philosophical claim, an assertion that the mind wearing it was prepared for the contact it was about to receive. They were wrong. The ritual contacted Murgo, a Great One infant, a child of Yharnam, the Pythagorean queen, and a Great One that the lore identifies through implication rather than direct statement. And the contact, despite all the preparation, killed most of the Mensis scholars instantly. Not physically killed, something more specific. Their minds were taken. The bodies remained, animated by something, doing a version of what they had been doing before the ritual. But whatever was inside those bodies before the ritual made contact was gone. What remained and operated those bodies was something else, something that came through from the nightmare, rather than something that had always been there. The theoretical event here is the nightmare itself, not the one that already exists in the game, but what it represents as a category of possibility. A nightmare in Bloodborne is not simply a bad dream, it is a space. The nightmare of Mensis is a location you can enter and navigate and fight through. It has geography and architecture and inhabitants. It is adjacent to the real world in the same way that the hunter's dream is adjacent to it. But where the dream is a space that the moon presence engineered and controls, the nightmare appears to be something that formed organically around the event of the Mensis ritual and the contact with Murgo. What formed the nightmare was the magnitude of the contact event. Murgo is an infant Great One, which in Bloodborne's terms means something specific that is not straightforwardly analogous to human infancy. The wailing you hear throughout the nightmare, the crying that drives people mad if they listen to it long enough, is Murgo's cry. A Great One. Infant's cry is not a simple sound. It is an event that restructures the space around it. The nightmare formed as a kind of crystallization of the contact between Murgo's existence and the human world, and everything that was present at that contact point. The scholars, the architecture of Mensis, the surrounding region was incorporated into the nightmare as it formed. The frightening theoretical extension of this is straightforward. The Mensis ritual was one instance of a very specific type of event, direct contact between a group of humans and a Great One of significant power in a context where the contact was not buffered by the careful cultivation systems that the moon presence had established. It produced a nightmare, a permanent, navigable, geography-altering nightmare that consumed the people present and restructured the space around the event. The question the lore raises is whether this is a repeatable outcome. If the Mensis ritual produced a nightmare by accident, by being too direct and too powerful an attempt at contact, then any sufficiently ambitious attempt at the same kind of contact would risk the same result. And the history of the healing church and the old blood suggests that the people in this world have a demonstrated tendency to push these things further than is wise. The upper echelons of the church were conducting their own version of what Mensis did, trying to bridge the gap between human consciousness and Great One contact. The Byrgenwerth scholars did it before them. The Pythagoreans did it in the oldest layer of the Chalice dungeons. Every generation in this world's history has included people who thought they understood the risks well enough to proceed and were wrong. A second nightmare, formed by a second contact event, would compound the problem in ways that are hard to fully imagine. The nightmare of Mensis has a physical location in the world, somewhere in the mountains where the Mensis fortress sits. It is bounded by the ritual that created it. A new nightmare, formed in a different location, through a different ritual, would be a second permanent restructuring of physical geography. Two spaces in the world that are more nightmare than world, connected to the Great Ones in ways that are outside the controlled channel the moon presence established, each one consuming whatever was present at the contact event and incorporating it into an ongoing geography of madness. Murgo's wet nurse, the entity you fight at the end of the nightmare, is worth considering in this context. The wet nurse is not a Great One in the sense that the moon presence or Ebrietus or the celestial emissary are Great Ones. It is something that attended Murgo, that cared for the Great One infant, that exists in the nightmare as a guardian of the thing at the nightmare's centre. The wet nurse's presence in the nightmare suggest that a space formed by contact with a Great One is not simply a residual effect, it is inhabited. The Great One at the centre of the nightmare is still there, or at least the echo of the Great One's presence is still there, and whatever attended the Great One in its natural state attended it into the nightmare as well. The implication for a world with multiple nightmares is a world with multiple inhabited spaces that have been peeled away from ordinary geography and reattached to something adjacent to it. Each nightmare would have its Great One and its attendants, and its consumed humans, and its particular flavour of madness, all existing in permanent contact with the surface world at the point where the contact event occurred, all of them impossible to enter without significant risk of becoming part of them rather than simply navigating through them. The nightmare of Mensis gives you access to the brain of Mensis, a massive entity that appears to be a brain that has been exposed to nightmare conditions for long enough to have grown into something far larger than any normal brain. It watches, it attacks with its gaze. It is the product of sustained contact with Murgo's presence, of what human neural tissue becomes when it is bathed in a Great One infant's influence for an extended period while attached to a human body that is no longer operating its own consciousness. The brain is what the Mensis scholars' collective minds became after the ritual took their individual identities and left their bodies in service of something else. A world with multiple nightmares would have multiple brains, multiple sites of massive, accumulated, transformed neural tissue that had once been human scholars or priests or anyone else who attempted direct contact and was consumed by the resulting nightmare, each one a monument to the ambition of the group that produced it, each one a permanent fixture in the geography of a world that is running out of ordinary geography and accumulating more and more of the space that forms at the intersection of human ambition and Great One power. Micolash survived the Mensis ritual. He was the one member of the school who was far enough into the nightmare when you encounter him to still be recognisably himself, still quoting the choir's texts, still chasing the contact that the ritual was supposed to produce, but now chasing it from inside the thing the ritual created. He is simultaneously the success and the failure of everything the school of Mensis was trying to do. He achieved contact. He is inside the nightmare with Murgo. He is also obviously not what he was before, not intact as a person, not able to leave, not able to do anything with the contact he achieved, except run from you through corridors, demanding eyes from a Great One that cannot give him what he is asking for. The theoretical world with multiple nightmares contains multiple Micolashes, multiple people who achieved the contact they sought and are now part of the structure of the contact event, rather than observers of it. Living inside the nightmare they created, maintaining enough of their previous selves to know what they are doing, but not enough to extract any practical benefit from the knowledge. Each one a trapped monument to the specific character of the Great One their contact event involved. Chapter 6. The blood of a god running through human veins. The old blood is Great One blood. The game is not fully explicit about this, but the lore converges on it from multiple directions, through the nature of what the blood does to people, through the location of the Thumerian ruins and what they contain, through the description of the eldritch truth and the phrase that recurs in various forms throughout the game about the blood-containing wisdom. Great One blood is not simply biological material that has unusual medical properties. It is a medium of transmission for whatever the Great Ones are, a vector for the fundamental quality of their existence that can be transferred into human physiology in a way that human physiology then responds to over time by trying to approximate that quality. The theoretical event here is not the scourge spreading or the transformation completing in any of the ways discussed in earlier chapters. It is something more specific and in some ways more disturbing. What happens when the blood of a specific Great One, one of the major ones rather than the residual old blood that powers the Church's medicine, enters a human system in sufficient quantity to produce not just transformation, but inheritance. The umbilical cords are the clearest expression of this possibility. 3/3 of an umbilical cord, the law tells you, grants eyes on the inside, grants the ability to see what the Great Ones see, grants the kind of insight that allows you to perceive the amygdala and to access the secret ending and to step outside the dream cycle entirely. That is what the game treats as exceptional. The ordinary old blood transforms you. The blood in the quantities most of Yharnam drank transforms you into a beast or something, adjacent to a beast if you lose the mental fight. But specific, concentrated, inherited. Great One blood does something different. It does not transform you into a beast. It transforms you into something that can look at the Great Ones from roughly their own level of perception. The hunters who achieve this, who consume enough of the right blood in the right way, are not becoming more animal. They are becoming more Great One. The scary version of this is not the ascended hunter who uses that inheritance constructively. It is the person who receives that inheritance without the context or the preparation or the mental stability to navigate what comes with it. The choir was experimenting with this. The living failures, the enemies in the astral clock tower, are failed attempts to create people who could ascend in a controlled way. They failed, not violently, not destructively, not in a way that produced beasts. They failed softly, in a way that left them in the garden of the clock tower, perpetually attempting something they almost reached, forever short of completion, possessed of enough of the elevated perception to be tortured by the gap between where they are and where the attempt was supposed to take them. The theoretical event is a successful version of what the living failures represent, not the ascended hunter who succeeds in the controlled way of the game's secret ending, but someone who receives the inheritance in an uncontrolled context, outside the dream, outside the hunt, outside any of the systems designed to manage what that inheritance produces. A person in an ordinary town who drank enough of the right blood through the church's distribution network, or who was born to parents who had drunk it, or who found a way to access a concentration of it that was not supposed to be accessible, and who changed not into a beast, but into something that perceives the world the way the Great Ones perceive it, without any of the preparation or context that the game's hunter undergoes over the course of the narrative. That person would be genuinely, functionally mad from the perspective of everyone around them. Not because the perception they gained is wrong, but because it cannot be communicated to people who lack it. You cannot explain what eyes on the inside show you to someone who does not have them. You cannot describe what the Great Ones look like when you can actually see them to someone who perceives Yharnam as simply a city with a plague problem. The gap in perception between someone who has inherited enough Great One blood to see what the world actually is, and everyone around them who cannot, would be absolute. Not a difference in degree, a difference in kind. Mikolash is a version of this, pushed to one extreme. He received enough of the nightmare and its associated Great One contact to perceive things that are not visible to ordinary humans, and the result is the character you encounter in the nightmare, running from you through corridors while quoting choir doctrine and demanding that Kos grant him eyes. He is not simply mad in a simple sense. He is perceiving something real that no one else around him can perceive, and has no framework for processing that perception in a way that allows for functional social existence. The cage on his head, the mensis cage that the scholars wore, was supposed to be the framework. It was insufficient. A world with multiple people who had inherited enough Great One blood to perceive the world at the Great One level, without the framework of the dream, or the hunt, or the church's research to contextualize it, would be a world with multiple Mikolashes. Not violent, not necessarily destructive, but fundamentally unreachable by anyone who lacked the same perception. People living in the same physical space as their communities, but inhabiting a completely different version of that space, one overlaid with everything that Great One perception makes visible, and unable to participate in the social reality of a world that cannot see what they see. This scales in a terrifying way if the old blood is in the water, metaphorically speaking, across the wider world. The people who approach the threshold of this inherited perception without crossing it would show up as the behaviourally disturbed, the violently erratic, the ones who begin to see things that no one else can confirm. The ones who cross the threshold would disappear from ordinary social reality entirely, not because they physically leave, but because they're no longer operating in the same version of the world. They are still there. They are simply, from everyone else's perspective, incomprehensibly elsewhere. The choir's research into the celestial bloodline was trying to produce this crossing in a controlled way. The orphans of the Healing Church's orphanage were given the blood in specific quantities and combinations to try to produce a generation that crossed the threshold together, in conditions the choir could monitor and direct. The results visible in the upper cathedral ward suggest that the choir succeeded in producing the crossing, but could not control what the crossing produced. The celestial beings you find there are not hostile in the way that beasts are hostile. They seem genuinely indifferent to you, occupied with something else, oriented toward a reality that is not the one you are navigating. They crossed over. They simply did not come back in any form the choir could use. The theoretical event of a generation that crosses the threshold together is different from individual crossings scattered across a population. A group crossing produces a coherent community of people who share the elevated perception rather than isolated individuals, each alone in their new version of the world. Whether that coherent community is more stable than individual crossing or simply more collectively mad is an open question, but the choir clearly believed that controlled group crossing was safer than uncontrolled individual crossing, and the evidence at the upper cathedral ward, grim as it is, suggests that the group remained oriented toward each other even after the crossing rather than fragmenting. What a successful group crossing would mean for the world below it is the question the choir was not around long enough to answer. A community of people who perceive the world the way the great ones perceive it, who have their own social cohesion, who are operating in the world while being outside its ordinary cognitive constraints, would represent something unprecedented in the game's history. Not individual Great One agents, like the High Priests or the Hunters, a genuine hybrid community, human enough to exist in the physical world and elevated enough to exist in the Great One register simultaneously. The theoretical event of that community acting on its hybrid perception is one of the most genuinely open questions the Bloodborne lore raises. Chapter 7. What the Thumerians knew, and what knowing cost them. The Thumerians are the oldest human layer in Bloodborne's world. Everything in the game that involves the old blood and the Great Ones passes through their history in some way. The Healing Church found their ruins and their old blood and built an institution on it. Yharnam sits above those ruins because the ruins are why Yharnam exists. The Chalice dungeons are the Thumerian world preserved below the surface, still functional in some technical sense, still performing the rituals and the guardianship that the Thumerians built their civilization around. And at the deepest point of that preserved world, the point the dungeon system makes you work hardest to reach, you find Yharnam, the Thumerian queen, and she tells you, without words, something about the cost of everything the civilization above her was built on. The theoretical event in this chapter is the Pathumerian civilization's fate applied forward. Not what happened to the Pathumerians specifically, because the game shows you what happened to them. What could happen to any civilization that replicates their relationship with the Great Ones? What could happen to Yharnam? What might already be happening to Yharnam? What suggests itself as the logical endpoint of the process the Pathumerians began and the Church continued? The Pathumerians were chosen, or found, or reached a sufficient level of development that the Great Ones noticed them and initiated contact. The specific mechanism by which this contact began is not detailed in the lore, but the outcome of it is preserved in the dungeon architecture. The Thumerians became the custodians of the old blood. They built their civilization around this custodianship. Their high priests, the watchers, the queens, they were all specifically positioned in relation to the blood and to the great ones in a hierarchy that seems to have been at least partially dictated by the great ones, rather than developed independently by the Pthumerians themselves. The civilization was built to serve the blood's purposes, rather than using the blood to serve the civilization's purposes. That distinction is the key one. The healing church thought it was using the old blood as a tool. The Pthumerians seem to have understood, at least at the level of their highest scholars and priests, that the relationship was more complicated than tool user to tool. The architectural evidence in the deepest dungeons points toward rituals that were not simply medicinal or magical in the usual sense. They were relational. The Pthumerians were maintaining a relationship with the Great Ones, and the terms of that relationship required specific things from the Pthumerian side that cost the civilization something. What it cost them accumulates in the dungeon record. The guardians become stranger as you go deeper. The rituals become more elaborate, more demanding. The architecture begins to show signs of the same spatial confusion that characterizes Great One adjacent spaces in the game's surface content. The Pthumerians closest to the blood, the ones doing the most direct work of custodianship, show the most visible signs of transformation in their enemy designs. The high priests and the watchers look different from the common Pthumerian descendants you encounter earlier in the dungeons. They are further along the process that the common people are just beginning to enter. The queen at the bottom is the furthest along. She is still recognizably humanoid, still wearing the markers of royalty, but she is translucent in a way that looks less like a visual effect and more like a description of her ontological status. She is less present in the physical world than she used to be, more present somewhere else. The blood she sheds endlessly is not simply an attack. It is a statement about what she's been reduced to. The most elevated person in the most advanced civilization that ever engaged with the Great Ones in this world is a pale figure in a deep room, bleeding in the dark, preserved in a state that is not life and is not death and is not anything else that human categories can cleanly name. The theoretical event this points toward is civilizational dissolution. Not the violent kind, not the collapse and abandonment kind, but the kind where a civilization continues to exist in a technical sense, while its people are progressively relocated from ordinary human existence to something adjacent to it. The Pthumerians did not disappear. The dungeons are full of them, or full of what they became. They are still performing their functions, still guarding the old blood, still maintaining the rituals, but they are not doing this as people. They're doing it as something that was people and has been converted into something more useful to the purposes of what they once served. The healing church, if the theoretical event unfolds, as the Pthumerian record implies, will end the same way. The choir scholars and the high-ranking clergy and the researchers who have worked most directly with the old blood are the ones who are furthest along the same process. The living failures were meant to be successes of a kind. The celestial emissary is somewhere between human and Great One, in a way that the game's aesthetics make legible as a transformation rather than a creation. The church's upper ranks are in the process of becoming what the Thumerian upper ranks became. Custodians who have been converted by the thing they thought they were custodians of. What makes this theoretically possible, rather than simply certain, is the question of whether it requires the Great One's deliberate action, or whether it happens automatically through the mechanics of the blood and the contact it enables. The Thumerians do not appear to have been destroyed by a Great One's deliberate decision. They appear to have been slowly converted by the ongoing process of their relationship with the blood. The conversion is not punitive, it is functional. The Great Ones needed custodians for the old blood, and they got them, and the custodians gradually became better at custodianship, as the blood did what it does over generations, And the end product of centuries of this process is a civilization of perfect custodians who no longer have any purposes or priorities that are not derived from the custodianship. A civilization that exists entirely in service of something outside itself is not, in any meaningful sense, a civilization anymore. It is infrastructure. The Thumerian dungeons are not ruins in the usual sense of abandoned spaces falling into disrepair. They are active spaces. The functions continue. The guardians guard. The rituals are performed. But everything that made the Thumerians a civilization in the first place, the politics, the culture, the individual purposes and desires and histories of the people who built those spaces, is gone, replaced by the single organizing purpose of the blood's custodianship. That is the theoretical event the Thumerian record describes as a possibility for any civilization that enters the same relationship. Not ending. Continuing in a form that retains the functional architecture while removing everything that the civilization's people would have recognized as themselves. The Thumerian descendant enemies you encounter in the mid-level dungeons are interesting in this context because they represent an intermediate stage of the conversion process. They look more human than the deep guardians and the high priests. They use weapons in recognizable ways. They wear clothes and armor that suggest social organization. But their behavior is not the behavior of a functioning society. It is the behavior of a society that has been retasked. The descendant moves through the dungeon space, doing something, but what it is doing is not what a person does. It is what a guardian does. It has been converted from a member of a civilization to a component of a mechanism. The transformation from member to component is the theoretical event in its most general form. It applies to individuals and to civilizations in the same way. Yharnam was converted from a person who built the workshop to a component of the dream's mechanism. The Thumerian civilization was converted from a civilization that interacted with the Great Ones to a mechanism for maintaining the old blood. The healing church is in the process of being converted from an institution that studied the Great Ones to an institution that serves Great One purposes whether or not its members understand that this is what they're doing. The conversion does not require awareness. It does not require consent. It requires only sufficient exposure to the blood and sufficient time for the blood to do what it does. The Thumerians presumably had a period in their history where they were aware that the relationship was changing them, where individuals and factions argued about whether the direction of the change was acceptable. The dungeon architecture does not preserve records of that debate, but the scale and sophistication of the civilization's infrastructure, the care that went into building the dungeons and establishing the rituals, suggests that there was a period of genuine intentionality, people making deliberate choices about how to engage with the Great Ones and what those engagements were for. At some point, that intentionality was replaced by the conversion. The people stopped choosing and started performing. The rituals that had been chosen practices became automatic ones. The high priests, who had been scholars and theologians, became functionaries of the blood's needs rather than interpreters of them. And the civilization that had once had the capacity to step back and ask whether it was going in the right direction lost that capacity as the conversion advanced, because the capacity for that kind of reflective self-assessment is exactly what the blood's effect on human consciousness removes first. The healing church is at a stage where this reflective capacity still exists in some members. Eileen the Crow and the hunters who went rogue and the various questline characters who push back against the church's direction are evidence that the conversion is not yet complete for everyone. But the institutional direction is set. The people at the top of the church, the ones making the decisions that determine what the institution does next, are the ones who are furthest along the conversion process and therefore the most committed to it. The people who retain enough independence to question the direction are precisely the ones who have the least institutional power to change it. This is how the Thumerian conversion went. The people with the most authority were the ones most directly involved with the blood, and therefore the ones most thoroughly converted, and therefore the ones least capable of steering the civilization away from the direction the conversion was taking it. The people who might have been capable of steering it were the ones with the least authority and the least access to the blood, and therefore the ones most insulated from the conversion, but also the ones most unable to affect the institutional momentum. Yharnam's social structure at the time of the game's events mirrors this Thumerian pattern almost exactly. The church at the top, most converted, most committed. The hunters in the middle, varying degrees of conversion depending on their exposure and history. The ordinary citizens at the bottom, least converted, but also most vulnerable to the beast scourge because they lack the context to manage their exposure. A pyramid where the conversion is most advanced at the top and least advanced at the bottom, and where the direction of the whole structure is set by the most converted tier. The Thumerian civilization ended up as a pyramid where every tier had been converted to roughly the same degree, because the blood had been working on every tier for long enough to complete the process throughout the population. Yharnam has not reached that stage yet. The theoretical event of Yharnam reaching it is the theoretical event this chapter is describing. A city where the last independent-minded citizens have either died or been transformed, where the hunters have lost whatever purpose they brought to the hunt beyond the hunt itself, where the church has become fully indistinguishable from the mechanism it was always in the process of becoming. A city that still functions, a city where everything continues, a city where the last person who was capable of asking whether any of this was a good idea stopped being capable of asking it a long time ago. Chapter 8. The Night That Never Ends. The hunt is a cycle. Gehrman tells you this in his way. The game tells you this through its structure. You die, and you wake, and you die again. And the city around you does not change in the way a city would change if real time were passing. The night of the hunt is not simply a long night, it is a specific night, the same night, made permanent or near permanent by the influence of the moon presence and the dream. The theoretical event in this final chapter is the simplest one to state and the most difficult to sit with. The night that never ends. Yharnam has experienced many hunts. The saw cleaver, the threaded cane, the weapons you find distributed through the city are not new. They have been used many times by many hunters. The bloodstains and the corpses of previous hunters that you find throughout the game are real, not decorative, and they imply multiple cycles of hunters entering the city and moving through the same spaces and falling in roughly the same ways. The city has been held in or near this moment for long enough that the architectural evidence of repeated hunts is everywhere. Lamp posts, safe houses, the workshop's tools scattered across the city. These are the residue of an institution that has been operating for a long time. How long is a question the game does not answer precisely, but the lore gives you enough to estimate. Gehrman has been in the dream since what appears to be the early days of the healing church or before. The church's history is itself considerable. The hunt that the game's architecture describes has been running for what the evidence suggests is decades at absolute minimum, possibly much longer if the dream's temporal distortion affects things in ways that make the usual historical markers unreliable. The night has been going for a very long time. Now add the theoretical extension. What if the mechanisms that the game's player might use to end the cycle had never appeared? What if no hunter had ever arrived with the combination of insight and capability required to challenge either Gehrman or the moon presence? The cycle continues. The night continues. Not just the same night, but an accumulation of nights folded into each other. Each new hunter arriving at the lamp in Cathedral Ward as the sun sets over a city that has been at war with itself since before anyone currently in it was born. The citizens of Yharnam, the ones locked in their houses, the ones who can still be spoken to through doors, are living in this eternal night already from their perspective. They barricade themselves at sunset every night against the things that the hunt is supposed to be managing, and the hunt never fully succeeds. And the next night is the same as the previous one, and the next is the same as that. For the ordinary people of Yharnam who are not hunters and are not yet fully transformed, the night that never ends is not a theoretical event. It is their current lived experience, stretched across however many cycles the dream has been running. The doll in the dream experiences this most purely. She does not sleep. She does not need the night to end to move forward with anything. Her world is the dream, and the dream is always the same. She tends the graves and she greets the hunters, and she sends them back to the hunt, and she waits, and there is no dawn in her world that changes anything. The theoretical, eternal night is simply her ordinary existence, extended without limit in either direction. If you feel melancholy talking to her, this is part of why. She is already living the worst version of the theoretical event. The eternal night is not something that might happen to her. It has already happened. What changes for the city of Yharnam in a night that truly never ends is a question about what the transformation process requires. Does it need time? Does it need the regular rhythm of day and night, of normal temporal flow to continue advancing? Or does it work within the eternal night's compressed, circular time? The evidence of the Chalice dungeons suggests the latter. The transformation in the deepest dungeons has been ongoing without any reference to surface time for as long as the dungeons have existed. The Pthumerians down there are not waiting for a dawn that will let the process advance. The process is advancing in a space that has been disconnected from surface time since before Yharnam was built. The eternal night of the hunt, if it continued indefinitely, would eventually produce the same condition in Yharnam. A space disconnected from surface time, still functioning, still containing its architecture and its transformed inhabitants, but no longer synchronized with the world outside it in any way that the outside world could perceive or engage with. Yharnam would not disappear. It would become unreachable. The way the Chalice dungeons are technically accessible, but practically outside the ordinary geography of the world. A space that exists somewhere and contains everything that was in it when the disconnection happened, but which the rest of the world has effectively lost. The transformation of the inhabitants would continue in this disconnected space. The beasts would continue to change. The hunters would continue to cycle through the dream. The church's upper echelons would continue their work of trying to bridge the gap to the great ones. All of this would proceed in the eternal night, in a city that has been cut off from the world's ordinary timeline until it arrived at whatever state the transformation was always heading toward. And then, from the outside world's perspective, there would simply be a place where Yharnam used to be. Perhaps a space that is geographically strange in ways that discourage approach. Perhaps a space that is perceptible to people with sufficient insight as a kind of wound in the world's geography. A place where something was and is now something else. The fishing hamlet exists in this state already in miniature. The hamlet is still there, you can navigate it, but it is not part of the world's ordinary geography in any meaningful sense. It is a place that has finished becoming something else, and that something else is sealed off from the ordinary world by what it has become. Yharnam completing this process in the eternal night is the theoretical endpoint that the game's lore points toward most consistently across all of its various threads. Not a destruction, a completion. The city finishes becoming what the Great Ones and the Old Blood and the Hunt were always in the process of making it. And the world outside goes on without it, without knowing quite what was lost or what it lost, living with the distant awareness that there is a place where you should not go, and a history that the Church and the Hunt and the scholars of Mensis were all trying to manage, and never quite could. The night that never ends is already the night of Bloodborne. The game begins in that night, and it ends in that night, regardless of which ending you reach. The sun rises in the Yharnam sunrise ending, but it rises on a city that the night has already transformed past the point of return. The dawn is real, but it is not a restoration. It is an aftermath. The eternal night, in its most theoretically possible form, is not something that might happen to Yharnam. It is something that has already happened to Yharnam, and what comes after it, whether a dawn that reveals what the night made, or a night that simply continues until there is nothing left to remember, having been day, is the only question the game allows to remain genuinely open. The architecture of the city carries the eternal night in its bones. The lampposts that guide hunters between areas are not simply navigation aids. They are the city's memory of a functional time, of a Yharnam that had streets and districts, and a sense of order that the lampposts once served. In the eternal night, the lampposts serve the dream instead of the city, marking the progression of hunters through a space that has stopped serving any purpose outside of being hunted through. The city as a place where people lived has been superseded by the city as an arena for a hunt that the city's own transformation makes necessary. Walking through central Yharnam in the game, if you pay attention to the architecture and the arrangement of the spaces and the evidence of what the city was before the night descended, you can see the ordinary city beneath the hunt city. There are market stalls that once sold things to people who were not dying. There are residential buildings where families once lived. There are institutional spaces where the city conducted its civic business. All of that is still there, preserved under the hunt's geography, and none of it functions anymore as the thing it was built to be. The eternal night has converted the city from a place into a stage, and everything that was built for the place's purposes now exists only to frame the stage's performance. If that conversion is permanent, if the night never ends and the stage never empties and the performance never stops, then the ordinary city beneath the hunt city becomes a memory of a memory. The people who were born in Yharnam and lived in those market stalls and residential buildings are long gone, transformed, or dead, or both, and what remains of them is the architecture they left behind. Repurposed by a night that has been running so long, the architecture has forgotten what it was built for. The lampposts are for hunters, the abandoned buildings are for ambushes, the grand cathedral is for the final approach to whatever the church's ascension research was trying to produce. A city that has been fully converted to a stage is no longer a city. It is an argument. The Eternal Night's argument is about what human civilization is, for when it comes into contact with something larger than itself. And the city's answer, the answer its architecture gives, if you read it carefully, is that it is for becoming a component of whatever it touched. The stage is the city's final function. The hunt is the city's final purpose. The eternal night is the city's final condition. And in the most frightening version of the theoretical event, that condition is not temporary. It does not end when the hunt produces its intended result, or when the great ones complete their work, or when the last hunter burns out in the dream. It simply continues, past all of those events, because the night was never a means to an end. It was always the end itself. The lore of Bloodborne, read carefully and completely, is a record of a process that was set in motion long before anyone in the game was born, and that has enough momentum to continue long after everyone in the game is gone. The theoretical events in this video are not things that might intrude on the world from outside. They are things that are already inside the world, already in motion, already producing their effects. What makes them theoretical is only the question of degree. How far does the scourge spread? How long does the dream run? How many contact events produce nightmares? How many civilizations follow the Pthumerians into the deep custodianship? How many nights fold into the one eternal night? Bloodborne does not answer these questions. It asks them, and the asking done well is the thing that makes the game what it is.